hi everyone. Thanks for taking time to tune in our Thursday Talk Shop session today. So my name is Chian. I'm from the Outreach and Education Unit of the Chian Natural History Museum. So before we start, please note that the session will be recorded and uploaded onto our museum website in due time. And the session duration is approximately 1 hour long, including the questions and answers segment. So today's session is part of our 4th season of the Thursday Talk Shop series. And for this season, we'll be focusing on our seas and its connections to communities, cultural identities, biodiversity, and sustainability. So our speaker for today's session is Professor Anthony Medrano, who is a research affiliate of our museum. Anthony is a historian of the Asian marine environment and is currently teaching at the Yale-NUS College. He was also the lecturer of Miss Kathy Po, who was our speaker for our Thursday Talk Shop session last week. Anthony's research examines the interplay between people and fish, science and society, and technology and nature. So today he will be speaking to us about food fishes that have fed and figured our hungry city, Singapore. Yeah, so over to you, Anthony.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Joshian. And I'd like to just thank to Jar, you, Joshian, and other friends at the Chian Natural History Museum for the opportunity to share a few stories about Singapore's food fishes, past and present. There's a couple things I want to maybe say about that. In each story that I'm going to sort of share, and some will be a little bit longer than others, but in each story, my hope is to kind of just shed some light on the ways in which Singapore's fish supply, entangled places, entangled waters, entangled different kinds of ecologies, brought together different kinds of cultures, and brought together different kinds of infrastructures. It's kind of through this whole web of connections and linkages that fish, in many ways, made their way to the tables and markets here in Singapore. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, and I'm going to do my best to kind of be clear and coherent. So let me start sharing my screen. Oh, I think it's this one here. Great. Can you see that okay? Fabulous. Okay. So like I was saying, so I'm going to share about a few different kinds of fish stories. And you know, each story I think brings together different kinds of cultures, different kinds of ecologies, different places, most importantly, different species and different infrastructures. And I think that's kind of the one thing that I want to sort of try to draw out, is that through fish in general, but through food fish in particular, we really can kind of get maybe a fresh perspective or a different kind of perspective of Singapore and its story, its history, and the surrounding region. And that's something that I'm going to really try to highlight. Before diving into a few of these food stories that I've got kind of laid out, I'd like to first set the context of Singapore as a hungry city. And to do so, I'd like to start by sharing a bit about population growth, or population demography, and ecology. These are the two kind of themes that I'm going to sort of try to start with to build the context of the hungry city in Singapore. So population on the one hand and ecology on the other. So first, population. Population growth is really what drove demand and consumption for a robust fish supply in Singapore. By 1940, for example, Singapore was one of the largest cities in Southeast Asia, which is a little bit hard to imagine these days, but it was larger than Manila, it was larger than Jakarta, it was larger than Rangoon, it was larger than Ho Chi Minh City, it was larger than Hanoi. The only city that was actually larger than Singapore in that sort of by 1940-41 was Bangkok, which had about 800,000 people. So population growth was a real big factor in the hungry city, or the story of the hungry city. Part of Singapore's population growth was attributed to trade, port development, urban expansion, and plantation work. So I'm going to highlight just a couple things about plantation work. So in terms of plantations, waves of cash crops facilitated swells of new migrants. So we've got Gambier being one of the earliest kind of documented plantation crops, really transforming the landscape of Singapore in a significant way. And in fact, well before the British established a kind of port here. So you had Gambier being one of these driving forces of population growth and migration. Pepper, another one, a driving force of population growth and demographic change. Coconuts, more recently, kind of late 19th, early 20th century. Coconuts being a real big force in driving population growth. And finally, pineapple. Pineapple was another really big driving force of population growth, development, and the like. And this photo, I should just point out, this is around the 1920s, I think, the early 1920s. And this is actually a view of Buena Vista Road, Buena Vista. So Kent Ridge Park, walking kind of towards 1 North in that direction, Port Park area. This is that general vicinity. So it used to be in the 1920s, it used to be pineapples. And then you can see out there on the edge, the coconut plantations. So these are just a few of the kind of plantation crops that were facilitating, in some ways, playing a role in Singapore's population growth. So while population growth, urban expansion, port development, migration, and all these things drove the demand and consumption for food in Singapore, it was Southeast Asia's surrounding waters, largely for cultural and economic reasons, that fed the island's food supply. So it was really the ocean around Singapore and broadly around Singapore that fed the food supply. So very briefly then, I want to walk through some of the region's unique features that explain the diversity, the abundance, and the geography of seafood production, all of which sort of found its way to Singapore. So let's walk through those ecological and climatic kind of features. So what are they? So here's just a kind of quick for everybody who's been to the museum, you know, on the ground floor, there's that great sort of coral triangle exhibit. This is just a sort of a reiteration of that. Where are we in relation to the triangle? Well, in one version of the coral triangle, we're definitely within it. You know, in other versions, maybe we're on the edge, but essentially we're in a place called the coral triangle. It sits kind of right there in that red dot, seen on the map. And the coral triangle is considered kind of the world's epicenter of marine biodiversity. So from a fish supply perspective, several factors make this biogeography special, and I'm going to walk through those kind of quickly. One important feature from a kind of fish supply perspective, one important feature is the bathymetry of the waters around Southeast Asia and around Singapore. So we've got in the light blue here, shallow water, and the dark blue, deep water. And essentially, Southeast Asia is home to the world's greatest concentration of shallow water in terms of area, and also shelf space in terms of continental shelves. So we've got 2 big shelves here that kind of play a role in that shallow waterness, the 2 shelves being the Sahu shelf and the Sunda shelf. So the trenches frame and bound the waters within Southeast Asia, which are the waters around Singapore. So that's one, or these are 2 important features about the biodiversity and the food fish that we find here. Another, monsoon rains. So we're in a monsoon zone, and these rains come, and they matter because they feed the region's rivers. They feed the region's rivers. As a result of these monsoon rains, more river discharge happens in Southeast Asia than anywhere else, and that's by volume. So we've got river discharge that happens because of monsoon rains. It facilitates the flow of organic nutrients that in turn feed the region's estuaries, straits, and seas. This flow of organic nutrients is really the basis of the ocean's dynamic food webs. So here we just have some pictures of that kind of river discharge. Like river discharge, the region is home to the world's kind of richest centers of several really important things, especially when we think about food fish. So I'm going to kind of breeze through these quite quickly. So the region surrounding Singapore, but the region of Southeast Asia and the Coral Triangle, home to the richest sort of center of mangroves. So we've got mangroves, peatlands also, it's kind of the center of peatlands. Seagrass beds, another habitat that is kind of super significance here in the region. And finally, coral reefs. More coral reef sort of diversity and number than anywhere else in the world, and hence the name, the Coral Triangle. So Singapore sits within all this. It sits within this kind of region full of peatlands, mangroves, estuaries, rich river discharge, monsoon rains, shallow seas, deep trenches, and coral reefs. Collectively, these unique features of the waters around Singapore make for an inexhaustible but richly edible ocean. And so now let's dive into a few of those stories that kind of speak to this edible ocean that surrounds Singapore. I'm going to start with terubok. So terubok, the photos behind each of these labels, they do not correspond to the fish that I'm going to be talking about. These are just photos I took from Geylang Serai. So they're just food fish. They're not, this is not terubok here. But my first fish that I want to talk about is terubok, telur terubok in particular. So terubok, or hilsa, as it's known in the Bay of Bengal area, is a really special kind of fish. It's an andronymous fish, which means it lives part of its life in the sea, part of its life in the estuary, and then part of its life kind of upriver. And it's upriver where the terubok spawns. So in terms of Singapore's fish supply, historically and in the present, terubok played a really significant role in the island's foodways. So the story of terubok, telur terubok, so this is fish roe, the roe of terubok. That story is really well known in Malay literature. There's a shair about the terubok, a kind of poem, a very long epic poem about the terubok, and the roe of the terubok. And the story and the source of terubok for Singapore's markets is this red dot, the Siak River on Sumatra. So we've got accounts from the 18th century, accounts from the 19th century, accounts from the 20th century that speak to supplies of terubok roe coming from Siak, caught by Malays, transported by Malays through Riau and to Malay consumers in Singapore. I was told recently when I was having dinner with the food historian Keir Johari that all the way up into the 1970s, this supply chain was still happening through Riau in particular, and ending up in places like Geylang Serai. So we've got terubok. The interesting thing about that story is that in one of the earliest sort of visual documentations of the marine biodiversity around Singapore and Malacca is the William Farquhar natural history drawings, which are the complete set of them. I think 450 something of them are held by the National Museum of Singapore. They're on permanent display and they kind of rotate about 30 or 40 of them at a time. But what's amazing about the terubok story, first we've got it showing up in these poems, these Malay poems and Malay literature. We also know that it's recorded in terms of the 18th and 19th and 20th century sort of import-export accounts. We know that it's documented in all these different ways. But what's really also interesting is that this was a fish that was depicted, recorded scientifically recorded by the artists that worked at Malacca who made the drawings for William Farquhar. And these would be Straits Chinese artists who did the work. And so terubok, is there in the late 18th, early 19th century. It's there before the founding of Singapore, and it continues to be here today. This was a picture that I did not take, but it's from the Food Pornographer, which is a kind of online foodie who does a lot of documentation. And that red bowl, that red plate in the back left there, where you can see the roe, that's the roe, that's the terubok roe. So that's the story of terubok. Important fish, very much embedded in kind of Malay foodways, connecting Singapore to Siak and Siak to Singapore. And the terubok is a highly seasonal fish that goes from sea to estuary to upriver and actually repeats that cycle several times. The next food fish, and I use that term kind of loosely, food fish. I mean, it's both fish, but I also think of things like shrimps and other things that we're consuming from the sea. The next one is the Ascites species. So this is the kind of critical core component of what we might call belacan or terasi. Terasi in Indonesia, belacan here in Singapore and in parts of Malaysia. So this is going to be the next story that I talk about. So terubok linked Singapore to Siak. Belacan links Singapore to several places, Bagan Luar in up the Straits of Malacca being one of them, Pulau Pangkor being another one. But the one that I'm going to talk about, the place that I'm going to talk about is Bagan Siapi-api. Bagan Siapi-api is located here in the red dot on the left. It's at the mouth of the Rokan River, a really, really big estuary, as you can see in this Google map, that kind of pink, brownish, grayish, that's kind of the estuary. That's the intermixing of fresh and salt water. That's where Bagan Siapi was founded. It was founded by some Hokkien migrants in the late 19th century, around the 1870s. And quickly they settled and figured out that that was a very particular place rich in aquatic life, biological life. This is a bit of a closer shot on that, the mouth of the Rokan River. The Rokan River kind of, it starts up sort of in the uplands of Sumatra and then follows its way all the way down to the Straits of Malacca there. And pours into it. But it's a really, really rich area. And in fact, the monsoon rains feed this river, which then contributes to the organic matter going down and thus feeding the biological life that's at the mouth. So that's where the community of Hokkien folks who settled there established a really important fishing base, a really important fishing industry, largely made out of belacan. This is a picture of Bergen in Norway. A globally, historically significant fishing port. For a long time, Bergen was the largest in terms of tonnage of fish exported or produced, the largest fishing port in the world. But in the 1930s, a few times in the 1930s, I think 1933 and 1934, Bagan Siapi-api topped Bergen. So Bagan Siapi-api, this river mouth in that town, Bagan Siapi-api, was the world's largest producer of fishery products by tonnage than this place, Bergen, Norway. And the core product that they produced was belacan. So it's a mash and mix of various types of Ascites species, kind of shrimp or planktonic kind of very small sort of shrimp life and aquatic life. So here we've got workers there in Bagan Siapi-api. This is probably from the 1920s, a photo taken in the 1920s. That's part of the collection of the KITLV in Leiden. And what they're doing is they use something called a dermal or an ambai. This is an offshore net that sits in the mouth of the river. And as the tides come and go, their nets collect everything poisonous, non-poisonous, big, small, doesn't matter. The nets catch it all. It's a multi-species fishery that they did. And then they would sort of do a little bit of sorting, but not much, but a bit of sorting. The species of the sort of the ascites of the shrimps and the like would make their way to the Belacan makers. It would go through a process of mixing, of drying, of fermenting, and then once it was a final product, it looks something like this. It's used, it's ubiquitous, really. It's used in so many dishes, as I'm sure we're all aware of. This is a photo I took again at Geylang Serai, but you could find Belacan pretty much anywhere and everywhere here. Interestingly, though, there's another thread to this story, and that is, well, how does it get from Barramundi to Singapore? And the way that it got to Singapore was often through shipping companies. And one shipping company that was kind of known in Dutch, at least, as a trasi boeten, which was a kind of a Belacan boat, is what the Dutch called it, was a fleet of ships owned by the Wee family. The Wee family made a lot of money through the shipping of Belacan from Barramundi to Singapore. And the Wee family, with that money that they made through Belacan, among other things, bought a house on Neil Road, which is the Baba in US house. And you can go visit that anytime you like. This is a picture of that house. So this house, one of the ways in which the wealth was created to buy and maybe own this house was through Belacan, the Wee family's shipping company that moved Belacan from Barramundi to Singapore. So that's an important foodway. That's an important food fish, broadly defined, that plays a role in Singapore's story. I'm now just going to talk a couple of brief sort of sources that are out there that for folks that might want to look into other types of food fishes that are around. So one really important source is this Maxwell study that was done. Maxwell was in charge of food supplies in the early 1920s. And he went to Clyde Terrace Market, kind of the big fish market in Singapore in the early 1920s and late teens. And he documented many of the food fishes that were being sold. I think there was a total of 75 fish that he ended up documenting. And he would write about, he would try to approximate and then wrote down essentially notes that he gathered about how are these fish being consumed, what was their freshness, were they a fish that would end up being sort of salted, were they a fish being sort of sold as fresh, so on and so forth, kind of just giving, I think, a real nice insight, in fact, into the food fishes of Singapore. So this is from 1921. There's a couple of fish that I think I want to just quickly point to, just because they've got great stories. I mean, so terubok is still here. That was the one I started with. It's the fish that it showed up in Farquhar's drawings. Here again, it shows up in the early 1920s. The one that I think is worth maybe speaking briefly about is the siakap, the one on the top right. Siakap, popular local fish today, probably in more global terms known as Barramundi and the Asian sea bass. This is a fish that's farmed offshore in Singapore's waters, but it would have been a fish for sure that would have been present in the rivers, in the estuaries, and in the waters around us. So that's just a little bit about sources that are out there. If folks are you want to pursue this a little bit more, this is a good place to go. The Maxwell's 1921 study. Another fun study to look at would be cookbooks. This is one from the YWCA International Cookery Book of Malaya. This is available in microfilm, as you can tell from kind of my pictures here. It's available for people to view at the National Library. So here we've got a book published in 1937, and you've got on left and right the food fishes that are common in the city at the time. all of the fish then would come with recipes, ways of preparing, ways of cooking. So another really important book. Mrs. Holtom is the wife of I think it was Eric Holtom, who was the director of the Botanic Gardens. So she was involved in putting this together. That is not ikan selampai. That is ikan tongkol, which is tuna, skipjack. It's a common fish, again, rich history. And I actually just had some here, made a wonderful dish, and I ate it for dinner last night. But that's not ikan selampai. So I'll talk a bit about ikan selampai. What is ikan selampai? It's bronze croaker. This one, bronze croaker. It's a fish that, again, one of the ones that shows up. This is a drawing from Farquhar's collection. So it's a fish that was present as a food fish already in the late 18th and early 19th century. So the, kind of 1803 to 1818. So again, a fish before the founding of Singapore, but already present in the food system, the food supply of the Malays and others that were living on the island. It's got an interesting food way, one that I'm gonna, I think, speak to. So we had terubok, the row of terubok, kind of really speaking to a Malay food way. The ikan selampai, as I'm going to share this story, it really figures into a kind of Chinese food way, Teochew food way, Hokkien food way, and that's because the bronze croaker seen here at Fish the Dish at Chong Bahru Market is an important source of fish maw. So fish maw comes from this fish, not only this fish, but one of the fishes that provide fish maw. And so here we see fish maw being sold. This is Jeffrey Tan, by the way, Jeffrey Tan, who's an amazing resource. I encourage everybody, if you're interested in fish and you're interested in food fish and stories about food fish and where they come from and how you might want to enjoy them and how you can do that sustainably and ethically, I would go see Jeffrey Tan at Chong Bahru Market, Dish the Fish. He's got a website even. He's fabulous. I take my classes to meet with him, and he talks all about the great food fishes that we see here in Singapore. This fish that he's showing comes from Indonesia. So it comes from, I think, the Riau Island areas, the waters around Riau Island. So this is another connection. We had terubok kind of coming from Siak. We had belacan coming from Bagan Siapi-api. And here in the more recent, I think I took this picture in like November of 2021. This was from the Riau area, and it was for the fish maw, mainly for the fish maw seen here. Another fish that I'm going to share about, I'm kind of going through this quite quickly. Chian, can you give me a little warning of like maybe when I have 15 minutes left?
Sure.
Okay. So ikan dela, also known as ikan kuning, is an important fish and has a really neat story. Before ikan dela entered the system, the food supply system, tanggiri was used to make fish balls. Then in the late teens, early 20s, a new community moved into Singapore, a migrant community. This is Okinawans. They brought with them a special fishing type called Murami, and it was a way of fishing coral reefs. Because of that fishing method, and they were able to kind of target these coral reefs, which weren't really exploited too much before their arrival. They arrived around in the late 19 teens. We start to see ikan dela seen here in 1921, also known as kasio kuning being yellow in Malay. It's because of the tail and some stripes. But we start to see this fish show up in the food supply really in the 1920s and explosively in the 1930s. Almost 100% of this type of fish was caught by Okinawans largely. They had a very special method, as I said, Murami. This is what it looked like. You would have a team of young Okinawan men who would sort of be at one edge of the coral reef, an offshore coral reef, and on the other edge of that reef, you would have a net and a boat holding the sort of the net open. So on the right side of the reef, you would have all these swimmers, and on the left side of the reef, you would have the net open. And what the swimmers on the right side would do, about 20 of them, 25 of them, 30 of them, they would swim across the reef, hammering the reef, as you can see here in the diagram, hammering and driving or scaring all these really small reef fish into the net, and then they would cinch up the net. And so it was extremely productive in terms of capture, but very, very destructive in terms of the reef's health. Because we're in the Coral Triangle, there were all kinds of reefs to be exploited. And so this is where Ecandela came from. Ecandela comes from coral reefs largely, they're reef fish. And it's really not a specific fish, it's kind of a class of fish, And I think I invite my taxonomist friends, Hokwi and Zishan, to maybe help me out on that. But Ecandela is a kind of group of fish that predominate around reefs. It enters the food scene and it becomes quickly the cheapest fish available to make fish balls. And this is the fish that is commonly, until today, used. So that transformation that happened back in the 1920s because of these Okinawans is a transformation that continues on. Most of the Ecandela now comes from Indonesia, again around Riau, where they have a lot of processing plants, and a lot of the reefs there are still the main source for that fish. This is a picture of it's from the Philippines, but it's a picture of that process, that Murami process of cinching up the net and getting your really big catch. This is just another book about food fishes. If you're interested, Malayan fish and how to cook them, this is available at the National Library. So a lot of fish took, what's the saying? A lot of fish worked. I mean, they bit, I guess is the word. A lot of fish bit. People were attracted to certain fish and they were really on. There was one fish that didn't bite. There was one fish that just did not make it, and that was the common tilapia. I'll go really fast through that story. The common tilapia, the one that if you go to any waterway, any canal way, this is the fish that you're going to see in the waters. It looks like the one on the right side there. This is the Oreochromis, I think. Oreochromis mozambicus is the technical scientific name, but common tilapia is another way of thinking about it. So 1944, Japanese occupation, the Japanese import tilapia from Indonesia, where it was known as ikan mujair, named after the guy on the left there, Pak Mujair, because he was the one who kind of found it in an estuary and started to grow it. The Dutch named the fish after him because they didn't really know what kind of fish it was. They sent samples to Leiden and Amsterdam, and word came back that it was a tilapia. So the tilapia is imported into Singapore in 1944. They're grown in fish ponds that used to be homes of carp, but the carp supply got disrupted because of the war. A lot of the carp were coming from Hong Kong and southern China. That was no longer happening. So these tilapia started to be grown in fish ponds. But nobody really took to them. And the war came to an end after they were more or less introduced, but nobody took to them because they were earthy, because they were freshwater fish, and so on and so forth. So as a result, this is a picture of the mujair, or the ikan tilapia. There was a kind of public outcry, the invasion of tilapia, not just in Singapore, kind of all over the place, but in Singapore as well. They were basically quickly and like rabbits reproducing in the waters in Singapore. By the early 50s, Singapore, there's no market for people to eat these. No one's really eating them. So Singapore becomes an exporter of live tilapia fingerling to other parts of the world, places like Sri Lanka, Hawaii gets their first supply of Singapore tilapia in 1951. Papua New Guinea gets a bunch. They were very closely associated with the FAO's effort to promote food security in the Pacific. So Singapore became, because nobody was eating them locally, and because they were just so abundant in the native water system, these fish ponds ended up serving other markets. So places Malaysia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and then the Pacific. In 1966, we kind of get the first recording of the common tilapia as a naturalized member of the freshwater biodiversity here. So it's a study done by Eric Alfred, who was one of the early directors of, or one of the first Malayan director of the National Museum, and he had a close relationship with the Chian Natural History Museum too, when it was the Raffles Museum. So the tilapia here in his study, it's number 32. It's actually it's the last fish that he includes in his checklist. Ho Kui and team have come up with a more recent checklist of non-native freshwater fish in Singapore, and there's a wonderful entry on the common tilapia and its history, and it's a history of its study as well. So I encourage everybody to see that study, published in 2020, I believe, and it's Ho Kui Tan and et al. Today, the tilapia is not really consumed by humans, but it is consumed in an important way by otters here in Singapore. So it accounts for, in recent studies I've seen, tilapia accounts for about 30% of the diet. At least that's what shows up in the scat of these otter studies. The last fish that I'm going to talk about, the last fish, is probably the biggest fish in many ways, because it's one name, but it's like a zillion species. One name, but a zillion species. And that's ikan merah, red fish, red snapper. In the 20s and 30s, they often said ikan merahs or red snappers. They would pluralize because kind of like it meant a lot of different fish. But I want to end with this fish because it's a fish that shows up before Singapore as a British colonial port, as a founding as a British settlement. So it shows up before Singapore was founded by the British in that kind of colonial way, seen here in Farquhar's drawing. It shows up in the colonial days of Singapore, seen here in Maxwell's study of the Clyde Terrace market. It shows up here in this the sea fishes of Malaya, which included Singapore in 1959. And I should point out two really significant things about this. So we had it before Singapore as a British colony. We had it during the colonial days of Singapore. This fish shows up. We have it here, 1959. So the picture there is of Yusof Ishak, the first president of Singapore, who was appointed president in 1959 on the right. And we've got on the left his father, Ishak bin Ahmad, who was the principal source of fish information for this book that was published by J.S. Scott in 1959. The introduction of this book was written by Yusof Ishak's brother, Abdul Aziz, who was the Minister of Agriculture in Malaysia, and who is the son of Ishak bin Ahmad on the left. So Ishak bin Ahmad, the father, his fish knowledge figured into this fish book. And so we have the fish showing up in this kind of, the wee hours of post-colonial Singapore, really that transitional period out of the colonial days and into an independent Singapore. And then finally, we have it here. This is the Singapore Food Authority. This is a picture of ikan merah being grown as aquaculture off the coast of, I believe this is off of Changi, in one of the fish farms. So this one fish goes from before Singapore, during colonial Singapore, during kind of the early days of an independent Singapore, and then all the way up to the present. This one fish really in many ways reflects the story of food fishes, I think, in Singapore's history. With that note, many thanks. And I welcome your questions and any clarifications, and then I'll draw on my wonderful colleagues for assistance.
Thank you, Anthony. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat box, or you may use the raise hand function on Zoom, and then you may unmute yourself.
Oh, should I stop sharing? Should I do that?
Okay, sure. Then
Or no need? I don't know. What do you want to?
Yeah, you don't have to actually. It's fine.
Okay.
Does anybody have questions?
Did I talk too fast? Maybe I spoke too fast. I'm happy to go over it again much slower.
I think the pace was okay. Okay, then maybe I have a question.
Please,
So
yeah.
did the local fishermen eventually adopt the Murami fishing technique? Or were they like maybe outcompeted with the entry of the Okinawan fishermen and their Murami like technique?
Yeah, so good question. So the Murami technique. Hello? Okay.
History.
The Murami technique was something that kind of enters the scene in the late teens, early 1920s. And it was dominated by Okinawans. They were the ones that pretty much performed that practice. And there were some reasons why they were the ones who dominated that fishing method. One, it was the technology that they knew, that driving net method. That's one. But more importantly, a key part of that fishing method, because you're catching fish which are located at these offshore reefs. And so you need to have a boat to go out to those reefs, and you need to have ice to keep those fish fresh so that you can bring them back to the market. And not everybody in the 1920s or 30s had the capital to have ice or had the capital to have a boat that could take them out there with ice and come back. So this was very limited to really the Japanese companies that were based here. And by, I think, the 1938, 37, 36, something like this, in the mid to late 30s, Japanese caught fish accounted for about 50% of Singapore's fish supply. So it was a huge, huge amount. The Ikandela, this kind of generic reef fish, really figured as a significant part of that 50% because it was a very cheap fish, it was abundant, and it was widely consumed because it was fresh. The other thing that I would say then is post-war, this method kind of fades away locally, mainly because of mesh nets, plastic nets, trawling, and the industrialization of fishing operations. You don't need to have a bunch of people swimming in the water when you can just kind of throw out a massive net that could be kilometers long, and you're just scraping everything. And so that post-war period, which is really the period that we're still living in, industrial fishing just took it to a whole new level, really a kind of a dangerous level, I would say, in many ways, because the amount that we extract from the ocean is just so, it's inexhaustible, really. It's just too much. It's so much. And it's like night and day in terms of pre-war, post-war. So, but in other countries where this fishing method continues, it's often, well, it's heavily illegal, but it's often done by children who are kind of bonded or leased out to fishing companies. And you've got a bunch of kids who are swimming around. It's very, it's something that one finds in the Philippines. It happens in Indonesia, but it's highly illegal for the kind of for the labor and child endangerment type of dimensions.
Thank you. Thanks for the very detailed answer.
Yeah, sorry, I probably went too long.
No, there's actually a few questions.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one question from Bergen. Out of curiosity, are there any types of fishes that are eaten readily in Singapore but not from the region? So salmon is one of them.
Yeah.
Are there any other?
Yeah, Hoqui said salmon, that's one. And there's different kinds of salmon. There's the Atlantic, does he probably say that? There's Atlantic salmon, which kind of comes from Norway, which you can You can see at the Jerome Fishery Port, it's usually in styrofoam and it's kind of flown in, frozen or fresh, but like, you know, on ice in these kind of styrofoam packagings. That's Norwegian salmon, Atlantic salmon. Then there's the king salmon that comes from New Zealand. This is another fish that's widely consumed here. Different kinds of tuna, kind of high grade, high scale, what do you call that? Like kind of Pashi tuna, I guess. I don't know. Pashi tuna is maybe not a technical term, but Pashi tuna is also consumed here. Other types, cod that come from maybe British Columbia area, other types of fish that come from the Pacific up north. Halibut maybe is also one, but probably not in big numbers. Jeffrey Tan, who I mentioned about at the Chongbaru market, he imports a lot of this kind of non-local, non-regional fish, usually cold water fish, but he imports it from sustainable vendors, people who do wild caught, people who are very much kind of, you know, they're green and approved, things like that. So those would be some examples of fish that are consumed that are not readily available in local waters. Lobsters is another one. Lobsters is one that you can find as well. And crabs. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question from Benedict. Benedict, would you like to unmute yourself to ask the question?
Hey, Ben, just ask the question, Ben. Sorry. Good to see you, Ben.
Yeah, I just finished a run, so now.
Oh.
Yeah, I just really wanted to ask, how, like, what are the processes through which history informs the way we consume fish today? In the context of food security, a fish like tilapia that grows quickly and anywhere and seemingly is bulletproof seems like the logical solution, but I doubt that the local population will be cooking or eating it, at least a lot of it, anytime soon.
Yeah.
So why does history still have such a strong influence on our eating habits around 2-3 generations after the war?
Great question, Ben. Great question. I mean, I think, yeah, you know, in terms of food security, you're probably right. You know, tilapia would be a great source, especially there were experiments done and there's plenty of data now that if you grow tilapia in the estuaries or in offshore kind of pens, it takes on a different flavor, a bit more of a palatable flavor for people. This was stuff that was being kind of experimented with back in the 1940s when this particular fish was trying to be promoted. Why does history play such a strong role in shaping food patterns? I think the thing, I don't really know the exact answer to this, but I would suggest or hazard to say, Singapore, unlike many other places in the world, Singapore is really awash. It's just surrounded by, and has been historically, but even in the present, it is surrounded by so much fish choice. And a lot of fish consumed in Singapore is marine fish. It's saltwater fish. Very little freshwater fish is really widely consumed. And maybe Zishan or Ho Kui could sort of comment on that. But my sense is from the history of things, it was always the taste of marine fish, whatever the marine fish might be, the taste just always was much better than the perception of freshwater fish, generally speaking. And the variety, I think, is another thing. That variety, and which exists still to today. You know, going to Geylang Serai, I mean, there's just so much choice there, and the prices are fairly, you know, they're like tongkol. Tongkol's an amazingly kind of affordable fish, and there's a lot of it. So, you know, I would say variety or diversity. It's one of the things that Singapore kind of prides itself on in terms of its food fish supply. Some of the things that I was pointing at earlier, and I think that is partly the reason why something like tilapia just doesn't take root. But maybe, you know, who knows? Maybe it's just also a branding thing. You know, we think about Barramundi, and Barramundi or siakap becomes Barramundi and siakap the same fish, but it gets rebranded as the Asian sea bass, and it just takes off. So perhaps tilapia needs to kind of go through a transformation just in identity, and not so much in terms of, you know, reintroduced maybe might be an idea. Much like king salmon. King salmon is a kind of branding gimmick, really, because king salmon is essentially Chinook salmon, which is the species of salmon. But king salmon is this kind of brand that is used by New Zealand fish farmers to sell salmon. So, you know, maybe someone like you or someone in that community who's thinking about food security and tilapia, maybe it's a matter of branding.
Thanks, Anthony.
Good to see you, Ben.
Are there still any more questions? Nobody?
On the econdela, which Zihan and I think Hope, we both are kind of shared about. Yeah, I was kind of trying to say class, it's what Zihan was saying, it's a fusilar. So this is am I right, Zihan? This is a kind of reef fish, a fish that more or less lives around the reefs?
Yeah, it's a family of reef fishes, yes.
Family of reef fish, okay. And the kuning, I think, comes from, I mean, yellow, but comes from this kind of distinguishing tail that it has, which is yellow. In Indonesia, it's known as ikan kuning, broadly speaking. It's in Singapore, really, and maybe only Singapore, perhaps also parts of Malaysia, but where you get the name ikandela being used. That's not widely used in Indonesia.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, if not, it's around 8:55. So maybe I'll just trouble the audience to help me to fill out the feedback form for this session. So you can actually suggest topics that you would like us to cover in our future, like webinars or Thursday talk shop sessions as well. So I've also, let me put the feedback form link in the chat box too. Give me a while. Yeah, so for those who still have questions for Anthony, I think he will still be here for a couple more minutes. And also you can email him as well. So maybe Anthony would like to put your email address in the chat box.
Sure, yeah. Let me see. Yes, here we are. And I think maybe as we close shop here, I want to say that Singapore and its food fishes, I mean, it's a really rich story, but I think what makes it so rich and what we have access to is really a great community of scholars who look at fish, who study fish. So Zihan, Hokwi, Ben Tan, who asked the question, he works for, he's really interested in sort of aquaculture and the futures of aquaculture. Jeffrey Tan, the fish vendor, the fishmonger, who's like, I think, a fourth generation fishmonger, who's based at Chong Bahru Market. There's just so much knowledge that I think we have access to. So, you know, if you are interested in fish, if you are interested in the stories about fish, their ecology, their diversity, their names, their, you know, everything from what threatens them and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a plethora of expertise just on this island. And I would encourage everybody to reach out to folks, because I'm extremely lucky to be able to draw on these colleagues in this great network. And at the same time, go to a place like Geylang Serai or Chong Bahru Market and just see stuff. You know, I mean, this is a really special, I think, place, and a great way to appreciate it is through its food fish. So I'll end on that.
Yeah, and also maybe just to conclude today's session, I also heard that you're in the midst of publishing your new book. Would you like to share more about the book to everyone here?
Sure, I'll pitch the book. Yeah, we're doing. So I've taught a class that deals with seafood for 2 semesters, and we've pitched it to Epigram, and Epigram's going to be publishing it. So it's 23 essays that are about seafood, where they profile either an organism that's in a seafood dish or the dish itself. But our kind of the narrative structure of each of these food essays is really from sea to plate, really. We go from the sea, we talk about the ecology, the habitat of the organism, and then who's involved, the different cultural ways and practices, the taxonomic histories behind some of these things, how they end up maybe in markets, and then ultimately the kinds of dishes that we see around us today. So it's 23 essays like that. And we've got, it's a range of students from NUS, students from Yale-NUS College, are the authors of it. We've got recipes from Hoqui's wife. She contributed, I think, 4 or 5. I was just so delighted, but we've got 4 or 5 recipes. So it's a book with food essays that are both historical, cultural, really doing biographies of sorts, kind of like what I walked through a little bit. And then at the end of each essay is a recipe that is original, that speaks to the dish or the organism profiled in the chapter. So yeah, we're really excited about it. And Keir Johari has some recipes in it, so does Pam Chia. We've got it's just tapping a lot of kind of food scholars and food enthusiasts and in Singapore. So it's about Singapore. I think we're going with the Hungry City as a title, but I could be wrong. It's still kind of up in the air. But yeah, anyways, I'm happy about it, and I'm excited for the students to kind of get their essays published in the book. So.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you for everyone for joining our session today. Yeah, so for those who are interested in Dish the Fish or in visiting Jeffrey at Tiong Bahru Market, I've put his website in the chat box as well. He's very friendly, so feel free to visit him at Tiong Bahru Market. Yeah, okay,
I should say too that Martin Lowe from the museum is like my co-pilot in all that I do, and so he is really, this is in a way, he's the shadow co-speaker in this talk too. He and I discuss these stories, we talk about sources, and he and I are the ones we would go to Jeffrey and meet with Jeffrey early in the mornings and learn things about what Jeffrey's doing. So I want to just thank Martin as well for all the help that he provides.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Anthony.
All
and
right.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
It's
Thank
9
you.
o'clock. Thank you. Have a good
Thanks.
night.